Hey everyone, Kibler here with a video type that I haven't done in a while. Today I want to talk a bit about the current state of the Hearthstone Standard metagame. I used to do these videos pretty often, but Blizzard started doing more frequent balance changes, and a lot of times I'd be like, well, I could make a video, but they're changing stuff in like 3 days, or they probably already made up their mind about what they're changing, so it has not really necessarily felt worth the time to put my thoughts out there in a video like this. But with the Masters Tour this weekend, there's at least a window before any changes will be made. So I thought it would be a good time to share some of my thoughts on the current state of the Hearthstone Standard metagame and what I would change if I were in charge of making these sort of decisions. I do want to first say that I really do like the overall design of the new set. Murder at Castle Nathria is very cool. I like locations. I like Infuse. I think they're really neat mechanics that I enjoy both playing with and against. And my goal with these sort of videos is never to like roast the design team or anything like that. Not be like, oh, this person should be fired. They're terrible at their job. How did this happen? Yet never my point. My point is that I want to provide actionable, constructed feedback for how things I think could be better, not that things are bad. So I also, secondly, want to point out that these suggestions in many cases are based on play patterns rather than necessarily just the raw power level of things. These two things are correlated, right? Players, I think, have more fun when the metagame is more balanced and games are closer. There's a wide variety of decks that have reasonable matchups and things like that. But that's not the same and only thing, right? Game balance is not the primary goal of the game design team. The design team's goal is to make the game fun. Balance is a thing that leads to fun, but is not necessarily like a necessary or sufficient component for fun. It is easy to have a balanced game that isn't very fun, and it's harder to have a fun game that isn't balanced, at least to some degree, but you sort of get my point. It's you can have a game which you literally flip coins. It's balanced. It's not fun, right? So the goal is, hey, we want to make things fun, not necessarily like the optimal balance where everything has the same win rate. That's never the goal, and I think people often get lost in that because of data aggregator sites and everything. They're like, this is what the problem is because of these sort of numbers, and that's not really the point in many cases. There's a common refrain when someone may suggest that, oh, you should nerf this card in this deck, and they're like, that's a tier 3 deck, you shouldn't nerf that, it's not even blah 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 win rate. And in many cases, the reality is that those decks often have poor win rates in the overall metagame because they are pushed out by particular sorts of decks, generally very aggressive decks that influence their overall record in the metagame, but frequently will have dominating performances against other decks and overall provide a pretty poor play pattern because there's few avenues to interact with them outside of just killing them ASAP. Things like Quest Rogue historically fall into that category, and I think there are some decks in the current metagame that flirt with that element as well. And the other thing I want to touch on before we really get started is the idea of buffs versus nerfs. A lot of people say, oh, they shouldn't nerf anything, they should just buff other things. This is problematic in a couple of reasons. One, if you can identify particular problem cards, whether they are balance outliers or whether they are play pattern problems, and changing those is much more likely to actually have an impact in the metagame than trying to just sprinkle buffs here and there. And also, if you have things that are power outliers and you try to bring everything else up to that level, you just end up with massive levels of power creep in games that are ridiculously explosive. A lot of people complain about power creep and then say things like, don't nerf anything, you should buff things instead, without sort of understanding the cognitive dissonance that's going on there. I do think that there is space for buffs in many cases, but I think that generally speaking, nerfs are going to be more likely to be effective, even though there is like an emotional reaction to weakening a card, an emotional reaction to buffing a card, that generally the emotional reaction to the buff is positive and the emotional reaction to the nerf is negative, at least obviously for the people who tend to play with those cards. But if you just keep buffing things, you end up with massive power creep and don't necessarily even solve the real problems. So just wanted to throw that out there. And another thing, speaking of buffs and nerfs, one thing that people often miss is that underperforming cards or classes aren't necessarily fundamentally too weak. It's that they don't necessarily have like the core tools available to support the strategies. And that oftentimes if you do buff a core element of a strategy to the point that it is playable, and then you give them more cards, then that core strategy and that deck becomes oppressive in some sort of way. So you need to be careful about where you're actually putting power and why, rather than just being like, oh, Warriors doing badly, let's buff their 1-drop pirate. Oh, oops, now they're busted when we actually gave them new cards, for instance. But anyway, let's move into the actual discussion of the things that, where I see things and what I would potentially like to see changed. The first card I want to talk about is Sire Denathrius. This is obviously a pretty omnipresent card in a lot of different decks in the current metagame. It is ending a lot of games, and I think for that reason it's getting a lot of attention. A lot of people look at Sire Denathrius and go, oh, I died to Sire Denathrius again. Oh, I died to Sire Denathrius again. And while it is the card that ends the game, I think oftentimes people get hung up on that. They see the card that ends the game, and they view that card as being the card that is the problem or should be changed rather than anything necessarily surrounding it. There's, again, that sort of emotional reaction to things. The emotional reaction to I died to Denathrius again, nerf Denathrius, I think comes through in that. And I think Denathrius, it's a really cool card. I think it's a really sweet card. I think that the things surrounding Denathrius are problematic and not Denathrius itself. For instance, I think that, in most decks, Denathrius being something you have to draw at the right time in order to actually infuse up and power it up, and maybe you play Talon to tutor it, and that's kind of cool. And, you're using a lot of support cards to actually make the card powerful, and it's the card that actually has counterplay by your opponent building out a board, and, maybe you need to use Denathrius to heal and kill their board rather than kill them. That's cool, right? When Denathrius is Kael'thas, Brand, Denathrius 6 to you, that's a lot less cool. And I think you can probably see where I'm going here, that I think the real problem with Denathrius is Kael'thas. And I think that Kael'thas is an interesting card because I think that if Kael'thas were added like one set left in a rotation before like Denathrius was gone, I would be probably perfectly fine with leaving Kael'thas as is, because Kael'thas is like, it's this big, dramatic thing. It is disruptible, right? It's a multi-part combo, and there's much more combo disruption currently than there has been in many previous sets, and I really do like that. We'll get to talking about some of that in a second. But I think that it's like too easy a package for too many decks to play, and it makes lots of games end in a very similar way that isn't particularly like, fun or interactive. Like I think that Kael'thas, again, if it weren't just always going to be in the same cycle as Denathrius, wouldn't necessarily be a card that I was targeting, because I do think that Kael'thas maybe can do some cool things on its own in other capacities, but specifically Kael'thas Brand Denathrius or Kael'thas Bolner Denathrius in Shaman just kind of ends games in a very repetitive fashion that isn't particularly fun. And I think this is one of the big reasons why you see, for instance, Control Shaman being an extremely powerful deck right now. Control Shaman, which we'll get to talk about in its own section, but historically has struggled to actually end games. And having this like, relatively compact combo package that like can kill basically from any game state once you actually get it going is pretty disgusting. And especially if you have the ability to like even potentially play like, another thing to copy the Denathrius Battlecry with Bolner on 10 mana or something. So I would love to see Kael'thas changed. I think that Kael'thas, the best change to Kael'thas is probably to somehow make it not count itself, so that you can't just play it. You need to potentially like play Kael'thas and set it up and protect it for a turn, or have like 0 mana guys that you're using alongside things to at least, provide like more components to that combo. Like if Kael'thas cost like 8 mana, or if Kael'thas didn't count itself, or whatever, I think any of these at least help mitigate some of the repetitive play pattern that you see with Kael'thas Brand Denathrius. Obviously, you still have the possibility, if it is just a mana increase, or even if it is just a doesn't count itself increase for decks like Druid, that can have excess in excess of 10 mana, to still be able to do that. But it does like increase the requirements for that to happen, reduce the frequency that happens in other matchups. And I think that would go a long way toward making this combination feel less frustrating and oppressive, as far as like being just the go-to end game win condition for a lot of decks. So I would love to see Denathrius stay the same, and Kael'thas see some sort of change. Next up, I do want to talk about Mad Duke. Because Mad Duke Theotar is a card that I've seen a lot of people kind of complain about. They're like, oh, it's so good, it's frustrating. There shouldn't be a card that can just beat you if you play, a deck that relies on one card. And it's like, well, yes, there should be. The game should have interaction, right? If your deck is vulnerable to interaction that exists in the metagame, you need to, either be okay with losing to that, or give your deck alternate ways to win. I've stolen, Denathriuses from a variety of decks and still lost games because their deck doesn't require Denathrius to win, because they still have other powerful things in their deck. One of the things that I don't really like about Mad Duke right now, though, and this isn't something that I want changed necessarily, this is just commentary. It's super commonplace right now, of course, because of the population of various combo decks, especially Denathrius style decks, and that ends up being something which is really punishing toward any deck that's like setting stuff up in its hand that doesn't have a huge hand all the time. Because it is a discover from your hand, it is much easier to protect cards in your hand from Denathrius if you are playing a deck that draws a lot of cards naturally. And this is one of the things that I often kind of come back to in Hearthstone, is that like it's always so good to draw cards. And there's lots of cards that make it very easy to draw cards. And that classes and decks that don't have tools that allow them to draw a lot of cards are kind of additionally penalized for a variety of factors. Not only that they have fewer cards to work with in the game, but things like Mad Duke or things like Mutinous are more punishing to them because they're more likely to actually be disruptive toward them, rather than, say, a Ramp Druid deck that is sitting there with 9 cards in hand all the time. And that's not really something that I think is easily solvable necessarily, but I think it's something that is important to keep in mind when evaluating, card draw and evaluating these types of things and these types of disruptive and counter type tools. Because I do think that it is sort of weird that like the decks that these cards are good against the card is also good in, and those decks are also the most resilient to them and use it very well because they just have so many extra cards that make them, like less vulnerable and more likely to draw the card itself. So still kind of a lot of weirdness. But overall, my general philosophy remains that I think that there's a lot of there's too much easy card draw in Hearthstone. I still think that's true in particular areas. And I don't know what to do about it, frankly, but it kind of is exacerbated by things like this. Anyway, moving on from these neutrals, I want to talk about what I view to be, from a balance perspective, the current biggest outlier. And I think it's no surprise that is Imp Warlock to a lot of people. Imp Warlock is extremely powerful deck that is both very high pressure, has a lot of early kill threat, and is very resistant to disruption. And the reason for those are really 2 cards, which is Vile Library and Impending Catastrophe. Vile Library is obviously the really standout. This is the card that beats you in a lot of cases, and I do think that it is the greater offender of the 2. But both of them have like a similar element, which is that I think that each of them are kind of just tuned a bit too high, in the sense that they probably shouldn't be 1+ imps. I think that either of these 2 cards, or both of these 2 cards, well, I do think that both these 2 cards should be changed. I think that, for instance, seeing Impending Catastrophe as like a win condition that, with like just Wicked Shipment in like Quest Warlock decks that are looking to fatigue themselves because they can just draw endless cards in a turn by like trading Wicked Shipment, playing Wicked Shipments, and playing Impending Catastrophe and drawing like 1 billion cards for incredibly cheap. That's kind of an awkward thing when this is at least ostensibly meant to be a support card for an imp deck, rather than just like the grossest card draw tool available. But I think both of these either should be, or maybe even both, depending on just how far we think the gap is, 3 mana, or do X for each imp you control, rather than X+1 for each imp you control. Not do this, repeat for each imp, should just be do this for each imp. The fact that Impending Catastrophe, if you have a single imp, is better than Arcane Intellect is kind of wild. And, just kind of explodes from there. Fiendish Circle plus Impending Catastrophe is, draw 5, which is kind of wild. And obviously Vile Library, similarly, I think just does a bit too much. I think the Vile Library, the mana cost change is either of these. I think the mana cost change is the harsher change, because you're trying to play a deck that is putting on a lot of pressure and doesn't necessarily want to be wasting this much mana on things, or using this much mana on things when it's like looking to develop its board. Which is why I think that reducing the power of them rather than increasing the cost of them may allow them to still fit into the deck, but not be quite as oppressively powerful. Like Vile Library, like you literally just have Flame Imp into Vile Library and you have a 5/4. Like that feels wild to me, that like, and then you still have another use of the Vile Library after that. It feels kind of excessive to me. It feels like it should just be, a little bit weaker than that. I feel like that would go a long way toward at least making the deck, again, like less oppressively fast and have less sustain in the form of both of those changes. Next up, I want to talk a little bit about Mage. Mage is in a weird spot where I feel like it is basically a class that like had very powerful cards that didn't necessarily have great homes. In particular, Magister Dawngrasp. Magister Dawngrasp was a much maligned hero card when it was first released, and then the hero card was buffed in multiple ways. It originally cost 8, and the hero power started at 1 damage, and they got changed to 7, and the hero power started at 2 damage, and Wildfire carried over when it previously didn't in the old version. I think that Magister Dawngrasp may be one of the most demoralizing cards in the entire game right now. You know, the number of games that like your opponent just doesn't play a Wildfire, doesn't play anything that actually interacts with their hero power, but just plays Dawngrasp, doesn't even necessarily replay many or any spells, and just starts hero powering your stuff. And then, you know, their hero power is up to like 8-10 damage and just kills you with it. And there really isn't anything you can do. And this is one of the things as far as like the play patterns that I think are frustrating. Dawngrasp is both powerful, and the play pattern of Dawngrasp and this escalating hero power is very frustrating to play against because you sort of have this feeling of hopelessness, you know, because you can't really outlast it. And with the addition of a lot of the powerful tools that they've gotten from this set, in the form of the skeletons, location, cold case for survivability, Deathborn for board clear and additional threat. I feel like there's just kind of too much going on in Mage right now that helps support this. And, you know, with the location as well, the location gives you this this incremental like resource generation plus freeze effect. I think is a little bit too much. And if you remember the location reveal stream, I was playing on that, and that location was 2 durability, and it has since been buffed to 3, which feels like an error to me. It feels like that location is a little bit too powerful. Like right now, like Mage doesn't really have like major vulnerabilities against like kind of any scale of minion, right? Like small minions, you have tons of cheap burn to be able to deal with. You have Wildfire, you have Reckless Apprentice, and then you have the location, you have Blizzard, you have Flurry, you have so many ways to stall any kind of large minion that it makes it feel very difficult to actually make progress. And then if there's Dawngrasp involved, it's like, okay, well, you know, good luck making any kind of progress, because if you play minions, my hero power is getting more powerful. And, you know, because I'm chipping away at all your stuff, and eventually I'm just, like, pinging you down, blowing you up, Reckless Apprentice, explode everything, explode your face. So there's a couple of changes. There's 2 changes that I would like to see in Mage, and it is to specifically Magister Dawngrasp and to the location. I'd like to see the location's durability reduced to 2. I think the card is just doing a little bit too much for its cost, and providing a little bit too much defense overall, making Mage, like, incredibly resilient to any kind of large minion. And then I'd like to see Magister Dawngrasp changed to only have a scaling of 1 on the hero power rather than scaling 2. Like Honorable Kill gets +1 damage. That obviously still makes the card powerful, but doesn't get out of hand quite as quickly. You know, makes like potentially different, interesting breakpoints, rather than like, you know, okay, well, I set up like a couple minions and they're all even increments and they're all dead to Reckless Apprentice and now you're dead too. I just feel like things like Magic Dawngrasp hero power, basically, hero powers are one of the most frustrating things to lose to in Hearthstone, and I think that there has been power creep since the original set that has power crept original hero powers out of being the things that often decided games, you know, which I think is a good thing. I think hero powers in original Hearthstone did too much overall and were too defining to games, and with the general power of cards increasing overall, that has decreased. But that has meant things like hero cards or things like quests that give you hero powers or whatever have ended up being further ramped up in power level, and those are the sort of things that take over games in an uninteractive way and cause these very frustrating play experiences. And I think that Dawngrasp is emblematic of that, and I'd like to see that changed. So, speaking of things that are difficult to interact with, that cause repetitive play patterns, and you know, can be very frustrating, let's talk about Druid. So Druid, I think, is in a particularly strange spot, because Druid is the core class that people are like, don't nerf Druid. Druid has like a sub 50% win rate. But if you look at Druid's actual statistics over, you know, a large sample of games, it's like gets beaten by aggro, crushes everything else. And that's not a very interesting, like, deck. It's like, if, you know, you're just like, okay, well, what you can do is kill this deck in the first few turns where it is spending its mana to set up, or you absolutely lose. Because I think that the sort of philosophy, the overall design philosophy that has been shown for Druid is something that I really, really dislike. And it's not just that they have ramp, and they have a ton of ramp. They even got the Widowbloom guy in the set, which is ramp plus card draw to give them even more redundancy to ramp up to things. But having things like Moonlit Guidance and Aquatic Form and Captured Coldtooth Mine means that they just continue to play the same cards over and over and over in these games with very little difference from game to game, because they have so much access to their deck. But whether it's in terms of Jerry Rig Carpenter's Finding Nourishes, or, you know, the bulk card draw of Nourish or composting on their token minions or miracle growth, but most specifically just how much they have to access the rest of their deck, right? Their games so frequently are just like ramp into Scale of Onyxia because I have a million cards that find it, kill all your stuff, play a giant thing, whether it's infused, blow you up with Denathrius or whatever. The games are kind of they're super scripted because of how much access that Druid has to the individual cards in its deck at any given time, thanks to having, you know, in addition to those I named before, like things like Planted Evidence to give them potentially more copies of more things. Planted Evidence, in the absence of the others, I think would be great because it's a discover effect, gives you more variety, but like it's frequently going to be Planted Evidence into something that finds one of the cards in my deck, and that ends up being really, really unfun. And so there's not really a great answer to any like individual thing like change this in Druid, because the problem with Druid is I think structural. That Druid has been defined as being you ramp into doing these big things that basically beat all the decks as long as you have time to do it, and you have all these cards that are redundancies in terms of your ability to do that. You know, there was a time when Druid was like, oh well, they're weak to big minions, they're weak to wide boards, they're weak to no minions when you have Scale of Onyxia and a million ways to find it. You know, now you can like clear 14 health of minions on turn 5 with Scale of Onyxia with regularity. So, you know, if you're not like basically killing them, you know, threatening to kill them before then, there just isn't much that you can realistically do. And I do feel like, again, I understand Druid's win rate is not very good, right? Overall, but that's because a bunch of people play these ultra aggressive decks that beat Druid. And part of the reason they play them is that they beat Druid, and lots of people play Druid. So I just love to, you know, if we could find a place where Druid wasn't just like so oppressively powerful and played the same game so often because of all this selection. And I don't really have a good answer to this because, again, it's not necessarily individual cards that are like, this is the problem. Other than maybe Scale of Onyxia, but I don't know a great way to change Scale of Onyxia other than like, you know, make it cost like 8 or 9. I think Scale of Onyxia is like fundamentally a huge issue with Druid's identity as a class in terms of ability to actually, you know, like just answer everything. And you know, is also just like this massive power outlier. But, you know, if you just like attack the ramp, I think that's one of the places you can go. You know, but then it's like, okay, well, what is Druid even doing if you're just making the ramp worse, which is mostly making the bad matchups worse? You know, is that interesting? So I don't know. I feel like Druid is kind of a major design problem with the direction that it's gone. If I were to specifically just target cards to change that were very simple, it would either be something like increasing the cost of Scale of Onyxia, because I think Scale of Onyxia is oppressively powerful. Maybe increase to 8, maybe increase to 9, who knows? Probably 8. At least start there. But the other change that I think I would like to see just from a both power level and clarity perspective, I don't understand why Nourish and Guff give full mana crystals. Every other ramp effect in the game, basically with the exception of like Biology Project, give empty mana crystals. And if Nourish is going to go back to 5, and if Guff is going to have like a hero power to ramp or draw, they should give empty mana crystals. Because, you know, Guff being effectively a 1 mana hero power that's ramping you every turn is bananas powerful. And, you know, Nourish double ramping you and letting you cast like a card to search your deck, like a Moonlit Guidance or whatever after the fact, is also just super powerful. And I think that change alone would actually be a huge hit to Druid. And again, like the goal isn't necessarily just like make Druid weak, but I think it might just do that. So it's in this, again, really problematic spot because of just the overall design direction of Druid. So anyway, other than that, alignment should not exist. Alignment should probably be like 10 mana. It's the most frustrating card in the planet to play against. It's not like fun or interactive in any way. Things that stop your opponent from being able to play the game and accelerate your ability to play the game, super unfun. All my homies hate alignment. Anyway, moving on from that, let's talk about Shaman. Shaman is one of the most successful classes in the game right now. I talked quite a bit earlier about how I think that part of that is due to Denathrius and Kael'thas. I think that if Kael'thas is hit, it's actually a pretty big hit on Shaman because it, you know, then has to win the game outside of just like combo killing with Denathrius. I think that making them win the game with stuff that actually has to be on the board makes, you know, games are fundamentally more interactive if you're not combo killing people, you know, OTKing people with Denathrius basically every game, because your deck just has endless survivability and card draw thanks to Famished Fool and things like that. Now, Shaman also just has kind of a more multi-pronged threat and win conditions now. It can just win the game off of Null Evolve, which is also pretty interesting. Schooling was already one of the best cards in Shaman before Infuse. And Shaman is one of the classes that uses Infuse the best because of Schooling, because of the hero power, because of, lots of things that generate multiple minions. And, now both Denathrius and Famished Fool and the Devourer all are powerful ways to leverage that as well. But I think everyone will agree that the most problematic thing in Shaman remains Snowfall Guardian. And I think that Snowfall Guardian, one of the most hated cards in in all of Hearthstone. I don't really think there's like a great solution to Snowfall Guardian that isn't just like, you can increase its mana cost. You can make Snowfall Guardian cost 7. And I think Snowfall Guardian is easily still worth 7. It at least, is a hit on the power level of it. One of the suggestions I thought was kind of interesting was making Snowfall Guardian a spell rather than a minion. Which is obviously a massive change, but making it like, a spell that is freeze all minions, make an like an XX elemental, where that's like the number of minions frozen kind of thing, which I think is a very elegant way of making it so that you can't macaw the effect, because that's really the issue. Is not just that Snowfall Guardian exists, but that Snowfall Guardian exists alongside macaw. And I think Macaw is a super cool card. I love the planning that goes into using Macaw in a variety of ways. But Macaw Snowfall is just so tilting that you end up getting frozen, 4 turns in a row and then just dying because they freeze your stuff and then their stuff that they froze unfreezes and they just attack you with it. So I don't have a, like a great solution to that. It could be something like that Snowfall Guardian does something to your own frozen minions so that they don't, they don't get to just unfreeze and then attack again next turn, so that you're not just absolutely crushing people by multi-freezing them and then you always get the first attack with all of your minions from Snowfall Guardian. I don't know, maybe Snowfall Guardian effect can't freeze minions that are already frozen or something, so you can't chain Snowfall Guardians. Maybe it has to be basically, freeze, I don't know exactly how it would work. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, obviously there is the just like make it cost more solution, but I think that even just making it cost slightly more, unless it's basically just like pushed out at a level of power level, it will still show up. And I do think that the survival tools that Shaman has are sufficient with stuff like Command of Neptulon and all the additional removal and things like that, with Knolls and whatnot, that you can get to a 7-cost Snowfall Guardian and keep chain freezing people. And it's less a raw power level thing necessarily, but it is somewhat a raw power level thing, because it's like, what are you even vulnerable to if no minions can possibly kill you? And it's also, I do think that there's the additional layer of, yes, you can play something like Starfish, but Starfish being, a frequently played card, for one, also is the sort of thing that is massively advantageous for decks that have access to tons of card draw, because any kind of tech card that isn't tradable is a huge punish to cards that have, or rather to decks that have limited card flow. And also, a card like Starfish being ubiquitous in the metagame is really bad overall, because it makes any deck that's trying to do anything interesting with its own minions that isn't just unfreezing my minions to attack you, just get sort of caught in the crossfire. I've punished myself quite a bit by playing Enraged Warrior recently, and just the popularity of Starfish, when it's just like, I have this huge buffed board from Mana Extractor. They're like, no, you don't. All your stuff's small. And that being something that's just like all over the place because these AoE freezes are all over the place, I think makes for a worse play experience for lots of decks, not just the ones that are like, using the Starfish to get around the freezing. Anyway, let's move on a little bit to Hunter. Nerf that quest. Come on. The Hunter quest has been like a incredibly uninteractive deck at the top tiers of effectiveness for multiple expansions now, and remains incredibly frustrating to play against. It isn't fun like at all. It's like very much like, oh, you rushed me down or you're dead. And I think that the Hunter quest having access to Renathal, well, Quest X generally having access to Renathal is one of those things that just super frustrates me about the entire nature of quests, because Renathal being a card which gives you this bonus by making your deck less consistent, in a deck that starts with the most important card every single game, is just exacerbates that problem that quests fundamentally have, that they get to have their most important thing guaranteed every single time, and other decks have to hope to draw it. I would love to see the Hunter quest, I would love to see it nuked from orbit, frankly, because I absolutely hate it. And I think that anything, again, that I'm talking about that gives you this repeated hero power thing you're losing to engenders this feeling of helplessness that just is not any fun to play against. And the Hunter Quest is at the point of very high power level and this feeling of hopelessness and helplessness. Maybe increase the number of spells per step, make the hero power set to 1 instead of 0, something. Please nerf this quest before I just play against it 3 times in a row and quit Hearthstone forever. Next up, Priest. I do think that Theotar gives decks enough of a potential out against Boar Priest that I'm actually not sad about Boar Priest for the first time in a very long time. One of the things I actually played against Hunter Quest, Boar Priest, Hunter Quest in a row the other day and basically wanted to stop playing forever. But I think that there is reasonable disruption now with Theotar against those decks, so I'm less of a Boar Priest hater, and there being nothing that you can possibly do against them now. One thing that I would like to see, and this is I'm sure going to be somewhat controversial, I'd like to see the buff to Serpent Wig reverted. And the reason for this is twofold. One, I think that it goes against the philosophy that was actually stated in one of the previous balance patches, where it was like, we don't want too much of the power of a particular deck to come from one card. And Serpent Wig is Naga Priest, right? It is like the reason to play Naga Priest. It is like by far the most powerful card in Naga Priest. And frankly, I played Naga Priest on literally day 1 of the expansion, and it was already pretty good. And I think the buff to Serpent Wig, obviously the deck isn't like the best deck in the format or anything, but I think that it both magnifies the importance of that card in all of those games because it's even, a greater component of that deck's ability to be successful. But it also makes it so that there's basically no incentive to play any other style of minion priest. Serpent Wig is so much better than anything else you can do in a like minion-based priest deck that you basically are foolish for not playing Naga Priest. There's tons of like new cards that like just don't see any play, that like could be interesting in like, a priest deck of some kind, but like are just pushed out by the existence of Naga Priest because Serpent Wig is so much better than everything else you could be doing. So I just don't think the card needs to be as powerful as it is, and I'd like to see that reverted. Which actually reminds me, I didn't have this in my notes. For Hunter as well, revert the nerf to Harpoon Gun. Harpoon Gun did not need to be better. Harpoon Gun is really dumb at 3 cost, 3 reduction, allowing you to play like Mountain Bears and Hydrolodons on turn 4. It creates tons of non-games, and the card selection is already good. The two reduction is already good. It does not need to be 3 reduction. Revert that nerf, please. That card is silly. Moving on, Rogue. Please nerf Mine. This isn't a Rogue card, but Naval Mine Rogue is one of the most frustrating decks in the entire game. Just in terms of, again, there's not much you can do about it. You have to be at, they can just do 32 to you easily on turn 5 or whatever. And there's very little counterplay available other than like, happening to be a Renothal deck or like, having a ton of armor or life gain, or again, just absolutely rushing down super quickly. I just think that is just not one of those styles of decks that even if it isn't high win rate style deck, it's just a super frustrating, deck to be as powerful as it is anyway. And would love to see that taken down a notch. And I think there's a lot of other cool death rattle things you can do in Rogue that you don't have to just be exploding your opponent uninteractively instantly. And that brings us to Paladin, Demon Hunter, and Warrior, which I think are all in, like, obviously Demon Hunter and Warrior and Paladin don't really see a ton of play in the current metagame. They don't have particularly strong win rates overall in the metagame. But I think that if we hit a number of these things that I'm discussing, you have a lot more space to play these other decks. And I know that people are like, oh, buff this, buff this. And I think that it is often dangerous, as in the case of things like Harpoon Gun or Magister Dungrasp or Serpent Wig. Not that Serpent Wig I think is like dominant or anything, but again, I think that you're better off nerfing these top performers rather than going and like buffing some of the best cards in the decks that they already exist in. And you have more possibility for variety if you're taking all of the dominant things kind of down a peg or two. So anyway, those are my thoughts. It's a lot. I had a lot to say. Have been playing a lot of Hearthstone since the latest expansion. I've actually been playing a lot off stream, which is more than I can say for most recent expansions. So I am still having a lot of fun. I obviously feel like I need to reiterate that. I really have been enjoying the expansion. The games that involve some of the cards that I've been talking about today, I've been enjoying much less. The games that involve the Hunter Quest, I don't enjoy at all. So yeah. Anyway, let me know what you all think of the current state of the Hearthstone metagame, what you think would make the game not just more balanced, but more fun, because that is, after all, what a game is all about. So thank you all very much for watching this. I do, again, want to know your thoughts, so let me know in the comments if you like my takes, if you hate my takes, if you hate me, if you love me, let me know. Thanks for watching. Enjoy. Be sure to subscribe. I'm going to make more of these.